The image of the Viking is burned into our collective consciousness, a towering, bearded warrior, axe in hand, leaping from a longship to plunder and conquer. We know them as master navigators, brutal raiders, and explorers who touched the shores of America centuries before Columbus. But when the raid was over, when the shields were hung on the wall and the fires were lit in the longhouse, a different side of Viking society emerged, one that history books often blush to mention. Behind the glorious sagas of battle lies a complex, often shocking web of intimacy, power dynamics, and rituals that would make modern sensibilities real. We tend to romanticize the Northmen, projecting our own ideas of romance and honor onto them. But the reality of their private lives was far stranger and darker than any Hollywood movie dares to show. From the brutal exploitation of captives to surprisingly progressive divorce laws, and from ritualistic sacrifices involving intimacy to the very specific insults that could cost a man his life, the bedroom of the Viking was just another battlefield. Today, we are peeling back the layers of myth to reveal the raw, unvarnished truth about love, lust, and survival in the Viking Age. What you are about to hear challenges everything you thought you knew about the Norsemen. The myth of monogamy and the high price of ambition. In popular media, we often see the Viking hero devoted to a single wife, fighting to return to her. While marriage was a central pillar of Norse society, the concept of monogamy was far more flexible for men of power. A wealthy jarl or king didn't just stop at one wife, he collected partners as he collected land or silver. Polygyny, having multiple wives, was not the standard for the common farmer, but for the elite, it was a dazzling display of wealth and influence. This wasn't about romance, it was about dynasty. More wives meant more children, and more children meant a stronger clan that could hold territory and forge alliances. However, this practice created a fierce and bloody competition at the heart of Viking society. With wealthy men hoarding potential brides, younger, poorer men were left with few options. Historians now believe this bachelor pressure was a primary engine driving the Viking Age itself. Young men didn't just raid for gold, they raided to gain the status and wealth necessary to compete in a marriage market that was rigged against them. The violence of the raids was, in a twisted way, fueled by the desperate need to find a partner in a society where the rich took them all. Perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about Viking society is the existence of thralls, or slaves. These were the unfortunates captured during raids, monks from Lindisfarne, villagers from the Frankish coast, or Slavs from the east. Once brought back to Scandinavia, they lost all personhood, becoming mere property. This status extended terrifyingly into the realm of sexual agency. A female thrall had absolutely no right to refuse her master. The sagas and legal codes make it clear that sexual access to slaves was a recognized right of the owner. A master could sleep with his thrall without any social stigma, treating her as a concubine. This wasn't considered adultery in the eyes of the law, provided he didn't neglect his official wife. The children born of these unions were often caught in a strange limbo, sometimes recognized if the father chose to do so, but often remaining in servitude. This systemic exploitation was the dark underbelly of Viking domestic life, a stark reminder that the freedom the Vikings cherished for themselves was built on the absolute subjugation of others. The weaponization of urge and fragile masculinity. Viking society was hyper-masculine, built on a foundation of honor and reputation. A man's worth was measured by his ability to fight, protect, and procreate. Consequently, the greatest fear for a Viking man was not death in battle, but being labeled with the slur urge or arg. These terms are difficult to translate directly, but they imply unmanliness, cowardice, and specifically, the passive role in same-sex relations. To call a man arg was a mortal insult, often leading to a duel to the death, known as a holmgang. The Vikings had a complex view of homosexuality. It wasn't the gender of the partner that mattered as much as the role played. Being the active partner did not necessarily carry a stigma, but being the passive partner was seen as submissive, akin to being a woman or a slave in their worldview. This profound homophobia regarding submissiveness was so intense that it was codified in law. Falsely accusing a man of being arg was a crime comparable to murder, because it effectively killed his social standing. This reveals a society deeply insecure about masculinity, where sexual perception could literally be a matter of life and death. Amidst the raiding and the concubines, one fact stands out as surprisingly modern: the rights of free Viking women. In a world where women in Christian Europe were often treated as property, Norse women held significant autonomy, particularly when it came to ending a marriage. If a husband failed in his duties, whether he was unable to provide, was physically abusive, or, crucially, could not perform in the bedroom, a wife had the legal right to divorce him. The process was shockingly simple. She didn't need a judge or a priest, she simply had to declare herself divorced in front of witnesses, once at her front door and once at the couple's bedside. Furthermore, she was entitled to reclaim her dowry and any property she brought into the marriage. This economic leverage meant that Viking men had to treat their wives with a degree of respect that was rare for the era. The keys to the household hung from the woman's belt, symbolizing her total control over the domestic sphere, food supplies, and clothing. In the bedroom and the storeroom, the Viking woman was a force to be reckoned with, not a passive bystander. When we imagine Vikings, we often picture dirty, mud-caked barbarians. However, contemporary accounts from the English chroniclers tell a very different, and rather amusing, story. It turns out the Vikings were the pretty boys of the Dark Ages. They bathed every Saturday, a frequency unheard of by the local Anglo-Saxons, combed their hair daily, and changed their clothes regularly. Excavations of Viking sites frequently turn up grooming kits containing tweezers, ear spoons, and combs made of antler. This fastidious hygiene was actually a source of major tension. The English chronicler John of Wallingford complained bitterly that the Danes were seducing high-born English women by, and this is a direct grievance, combing their hair, taking baths, and changing their tunics. The Vikings used cleanliness as a tool of seduction, and it worked. While the local men might have prided themselves on their rugged, and smelly, piety, the Vikings understood that basic grooming was a powerful aphrodisiac. It suggests a culture that valued aesthetics and presentation far more than their savage reputation implies. While cleanliness and divorce rites seem palatable, other Viking practices were the stuff of nightmares. The most detailed, and horrifying, account of Viking rituals comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered a group of Vikings, known as the Rus, on the Volga River in the 10th century. He witnessed the funeral of a chieftain, a ceremony that involved a terrifying mix of alcohol, sexuality, and human sacrifice. Ibn Fadlan describes how, upon the chieftain's death, one of his slave girls volunteered to join him in the afterlife. What followed was a grueling ritual where the girl was intoxicated and taken from tent to tent, having intercourse with the chieftain's male relatives. Each man told her, "Tell your master I did this out of love for him." The ritual culminated with the girl being ritualistically killed by an old woman known as the Angel of Death, while the men beat their shields to drown out her screams. This wasn't random violence, it was a highly structured, spiritual performance where sexuality was used as a bridge between the living and the dead. It is a chilling reminder of how different their moral compass was from our own. Hospitality was a sacred duty in the Norse world. Turning away a traveler could bring bad luck or the wrath of the gods. Since Odin was known to wander the world in disguise, this hospitality sometimes extended into sleeping arrangements that would baffle us today. In the crowded longhouses, privacy was non-existent. Everyone, family, slaves, and guests slept on raised platforms along the walls, often huddled together for warmth. There are mentions in sagas and myths that suggest this proximity sometimes led to bed sharing that went beyond simple warmth. While the idea of a host offering his wife to a guest is likely a myth or a literary exaggeration used to test a hero's moral fiber, the physical reality of the longhouse meant that sexual acts were rarely private. Intimacy happened in the dark, surrounded by sleeping kin and livestock. This lack of privacy likely fostered a much more open, pragmatic attitude toward bodies and sex than the shame-filled secrecy that would come later with the strict enforcement of Christian doctrine. While polygamy was acceptable for men, the rules for women were starkly different. Adultery committed by a wife was considered a grave offense against the family honor and lineage. Because inheritance and clan loyalty were paramount, ensuring a child's paternity was non-negotiable. If a woman was caught cheating, the consequences could be lethal. A husband had the legal right to kill both his wife and her lover if he caught them in the act. There was no trial, no jury, just immediate, bloody justice. However, this wasn't just about jealousy, it was about property and theft. In the Viking legal mindset, seducing another man's wife was akin to stealing his most valuable asset. The lover could also be fined heavily if he wasn't killed, paying an atonement to the husband. It highlights a brutal double standard. Men could roam freely among slaves and concubines, but a wife's fidelity was guarded by the edge of an axe. Beyond the laws of men, the Vikings lived in a world governed by the whims of gods. Their survival depended on the harvest, and the harvest depended on fertility. This connection was celebrated in rituals that linked human sexuality directly to the divine. There is archaeological and literary evidence suggesting sacred marriages or hieros gamos rituals where a priest and priestess, or a king and a chosen woman, would enact a sexual union to bless the land. Statues of the god Freyr, the deity of fertility and peace, were often depicted with an exaggerated phallus, symbolizing the generative power of nature. During the festivals dedicated to him, taboos were likely relaxed. These weren't orgies for the sake of pleasure, but desperate, sacred pleas to the earth to yield food. The act of sex was elevated from a private pleasure to a cosmic necessity. They believed that by enacting creation, they ensured the sun would shine and the crops would grow. It frames their sexuality not as sinful, but as a vital, life-sustaining force. As the Viking Age drew to a close around the 11th century, a massive cultural shift occurred. The arrival of Christianity brought with it a new set of sexual morals that clashed violently with Norse tradition. The church cracked down on polygamy, branded the children of concubines as illegitimate, and enforced strict monogamy. The open, somewhat pragmatic view of sexuality was replaced by the concept of sin. This transition wasn't smooth. We see evidence of Vikings trying to hedge their bets wearing a cross but also carrying a Thor's hammer amulet. But eventually, the old ways were stamped out. The thralls were slowly emancipated, or transformed into serfs, the sacred marriages were banned as pagan heresy, and the divorce rights of women were severely curtailed under Christian law. The unique, brutal, and fascinating sexual ecosystem of the Viking Age was buried, leaving us only with the sanitized stories of battles and voyages. We have journeyed through the smoky longhouses, the frozen battlefields, and the hidden rituals of the Viking world. It's clear that their society was not just about the clash of steel, but about a complex, often contradictory struggle for survival, legacy, and connection. They were a people who could be shockingly progressive one moment and brutally exploitative the next, driven by a worldview where the boundaries between life, death, and sex were inextricably linked. What part of the Viking lifestyle shocked you the most? Was it the surprisingly modern divorce laws, or the terrifying funeral rituals of the Rus? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of the Northmen, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss out on the dark secrets of the past. Until next time, keep questioning history.